Hello and welcome to Sound Librarian. I'm Stefan Schutz. Today we're going to have a look at another Sega Genesis game, or Sega Master System as they were called in Australia. This game is another game that personally I enjoyed, but I actually had this recommended to me by somebody else as one that had significant audio. And when I got a copy of it, I remembered how significant the audio was. This again, I've spoken in the past about games that sort of used more of a noise basis for their music and sound effects. And because of the limitations of the consoles, a lot of people were experimenting with things that were very basic forms of synthesis. And I think Starflight does this. A lot of the music that is created for Starflight, really, it's kind of hard to work out what sort of instruments they're trying to emulate. And I don't think they are trying to make it sound like a piano or an orchestral instrument or a real instrument. I think they've just embraced the idea that some of these instruments are just synthetic noise, and they've gone with that. So there are some elements from the sound as well that are relevant for Starflight. It has some digitized voice. It's very basic, but it's in there. And there's some interesting use of loops in there as well, which we'll have a look at. So let's have a look at Starflight and see what we can hear. So I think there are two key aspects about the audio in Starflight that I want to mention. And the first is that opening musical theme we just saw. And that's why I left it going, even though the screen's fairly much a static screen. I left it to play through all of that because it really is quite an interesting piece of music. As I said in the introduction, what they've done is they've understood the limitations of the sound chips that they have available. And although these limitations existed for a lot of games produced of this era, what many people did is they tried to make the sound chip sound a bit like a piano or a bit like strings or a bit like drums. And they were trying to synthesize realistic sounding instruments. Whereas Starflight, they really seem to have embraced the idea that these are synthesis. These are synthesis chips. They will never sound like a real instrument. And so that opening theme had really what sounded like surges of noise and sounds that really weren't trying to be anything other than what they were. They were synthetic, mechanical, electronic instruments. Now, it might have sounded as though the recording was somewhat distorted. That's actually not the case. That distortion, when I recorded this, the levels were well and truly within the range of the input levels. So that distortion was part of the sound they were using. Now again, I'm not sure whether that was an artifact of the synthetic chips they were using or whether they purposely added distortion. It wouldn't surprise me if that distortion was intentional. Now, one of the other aspects of Starflight, which I really, really love, you can actually hear here. There are various different sounds for what's going on. The spaceship engines at the moment while it's in orbit, bringing up the various different UI screens and actions like firing weapons, mining, etc. But when you actually float in space, or when you land on the planet, if there is nothing occurring, there is silence. This is actually really, really rare. Now, again, I'm not sure whether that was a decision of, well, we've got a limited sound engine, so we just won't play anything. But with this game, when you're on the surface, when your vehicle moves, it makes sounds. When you fire or mine, it makes sounds. But the environment is silent. If there is occasionally a wind sound, it is usually because there is a storm occurring. There is usually an event. So what Starflight has done is it's made a decision, it's made a design decision that things of note make sound. A storm makes sound, your vehicle makes sound, an action makes sound, picking up minerals makes sound. But other than that, you're on desolate planets or you're in space and there is silence. This is actually a really brave move, especially for a game that's this old. Silence is an important part of sound design, but it's something that does not get used that often because often people are, I think, fearful that if they have silence in a game, it will be perceived that there is something wrong. I think in this particular game, especially when you're out in space, if you stop your engines running, you get silence, which is completely appropriate for the location of being out in space. But it also just adds a lot to the whole idea of isolation, of how big space is. The fact that you are a ship with a huge number of galaxies and star systems to explore. So I really like the fact that they have used silence as part of the sound design. So really, there's not necessarily a lot else to say about this game. The nature of some of these older games is that they were simpler games, and so there's less to talk about. So obviously the reviews of some of these games will be shorter. It doesn't mean that they're any less important. Some of these earlier games really did groundbreaking things for the time, and those things have defined where we are now as far as game development is concerned. So although Starflight may only have a handful of things that are noteworthy and are worth discussing and analysing, those things are very, very important. And this is really why I've included this game within this overall series. So Starflight was actually a very, very big game. There's a huge scope of it. And there were, I think, a limited number of sounds that you do get presented over and over again. So there were definitely sounds in there that I find quite repetitive and a bit annoying because of that. And that was the nature of the game and the limitations of the platform. But I still think there are things in there that are significant from a positive point of view. So it's interesting to have a game that has elements that you can look at critically and think, yeah, this could have been a lot better, and other elements that were really quite groundbreaking at the time. So again, I would recommend, if you have the ability to have a closer look at Starflight, please take advantage of that. And I hope this has been interesting for you. Thank you very much for watching.